Hello and welcome to Education Scotland's The Pedagogy Podcast. I'm your host, Bex Ewart, and I will be leading us through some really interesting conversations around about pedagogy with a really wide and broad spectrum of educational professionals, children and young people. This podcast came about as a response to the OECD report, which found that in order to improve the quality of outcomes for our children, practitioners and teachers need to be supported to explore their own pedagogy and their practice through a pedagogical lens. Hi everybody and welcome to this episode of Education Scotland's The Pedagogy Podcast. And this afternoon, or for our guest this morning, we are talking with Dr Dan Wuori, who is the founder and president of the Early Childhood Policy organisation and also a senior early childhood advisor at the Hunt Institute. Welcome, Dan. How are you?
Bex, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming. So let's just crack straight on in there. Can you give us a bit of a kind of potted history as to how you find yourself where you are just now?
How I find myself? Well, so my story is an increasingly long one that spans now a little over 30 years in early childhood. I began my working life with a brief stint in broadcast journalism as a younger guy before I found my calling in life and realized that I was meant to work with and here more recently kind of work for young children. And I've had the good fortune really to work at every level really of the field. I began, my very first exposure to working with young children was as an hourly employee in a childcare sort of setting. I realized that it was the thing for me at that point, went to graduate school and became a public school kindergarten teacher here in my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina, in the United States. And, went on subsequently, I was a school district administrator leading early childhood programs across a number of elementary schools. And then had the good fortune to go and help to lead the state of South Carolina's early childhood education agency for about 14 or so years. And so, had this wonderful experience kind of going from the classroom to gradually higher levels of responsibility and getting to the state level. Overseeing those programs for the state. And then here most recently, in the past 5 years, I have worked as the senior director of early learning, as you mentioned, at a place called the Hunt Institute. The Institute is based in the state of North Carolina here in the U.S. and was founded by a gentleman named Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina. And it is a public policy support and think tank that works with elected officials here in the U.S. So we work closely with governors' offices and with state lawmakers across the country. So I was lucky enough to sort of found the early childhood team there at the Institute and grow it over the past several years. I remain very much connected to the Hunt Institute at this point as an advisor, but have recently spun off, as you mentioned, into my own sort of consulting line and have launched a business of my own called Early Childhood Policy Solutions, through which I hope to continue doing a lot of this public policy work on behalf of young kids. I think the other interesting part maybe of my story, and probably the way that we found one another, is that I have had an amazing opportunity to through social media to help to educate hopefully parents and the public and policymakers as well about the importance of the early years. And so that has been a really gratifying experience. Have connected with new friends and colleagues all over the world, including right there in Scotland. So I'm excited. I think that's probably how we're having this conversation today.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny, isn't it, how those webs kind of can grow and develop. Do you want to give your Twitter/X handle so people can find you
Sure,
there?
it's my name. So Dan Wuori, and it's DanWuori, at Twitter, or now X.
X, yeah. And yeah, the kind of the wee tweets that you put up there are wee kind of snippets of joy every time that I see them. But they are, like you say, they capture the joyful aspect of it, but they also start to interrogate a little bit about kind of helping folk to understand what they're seeing and the meaning behind
Well,
what they're
and that's,
seeing.
as someone who has worked in the field for a long time, I think of my own pre-service sort of experience going to graduate school and preparing to be a teacher, and as fascinating as I have always found child development, at the time, it was mostly something you had to read about, right? And so it was something that you sort of learned about in theory, and maybe you were lucky enough, if you had some job or an opportunity maybe to visit a lab school or something for a short period of time, as a pre-service teacher, you'd have a chance to actually see some of these concepts in practice with young children. But what I have discovered is, now with Instagram and TikTok and all of these social media platforms, there is now sort of out in the public domain this amazing repository of examples that really can help to illuminate. So you're right. What I've, where I think I've found maybe the most success, is in sort of matching up some of these video examples then with my own explanations around, like, what are we seeing here, and what does this tell us about child development? And it has definitely grown a sizable audience.
One of the other things that I was interested in as you were talking there about your kind of trajectory through your career was the fact that you're kind of negotiating that space between policy and knowledge and research, but I guess also a little bit of the kind of political tightrope there as well. Does that influence
Yeah,
your
I
work
think
there?
that's
Or,
I,
yeah.
I think that's fair. I think the Hunt Institute describes its work as being kind of at the intersection of policy and politics, and no question. But I would say that has been, Bex, one of the most rewarding parts of this job. The Institute is a nonpartisan or a bipartisan sort of organization, in the sense that we are there to be a support across the political spectrum, and so have worked with all sorts of political leaders in all sorts of contexts. And it's just a matter of sort of matching up that policy conversation to the right context. And I think what we're seeing in the United States, at least, is tremendous leadership on a bipartisan basis. We have two major political parties here in the United States, and so definitely seeing in states across the country, tremendous leadership from both.
It's brilliant. I'm really glad to hear that, because ultimately it's for all of our children, isn't it? So this is obviously the Pedagogy Podcast. So I'm interested to find out what the term pedagogy means to you and how that is embodied in your practice and your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I would say it's really it's a very important part of my day-to-day life, but also um, I may have a little different perspective on it. I mean, obviously, as a former classroom teacher, pedagogy is sort of about the art and the practice of teaching, and how we as adults or teachers. I mean, obviously we are learners as adults as well, but as teachers, how we help to support the learning. In my case, of very young children. And so, sort of harkening back to this social media question, I take a very broad perspective of pedagogy, in the sense that I'm increasingly thinking of it as extending well beyond the classroom walls, right? Certainly, teachers employ pedagogy professionally, but for parents and grandparents and really anyone who interacts with young children, there is an opportunity to help shape their learning that comes from an understanding in this case of their developmental stage. And so a lot of my kind of public facing work has been around helping adults to understand how young children develop and how that understanding can really unlock very powerful forms of learning when you match the right experiences with children at the right age.
So I think, yeah, that really chimes, because certainly in Scotland we have that kind of holistic view of the curriculum as not only what happens in school or within school time, but also far more broadly. But it is also that deep understanding of being able to make sense of what you see, because I guess typically it's difficult to really understand the complexity of what's going on for young children when it looks as though they're kind of just making mistakes or crashing a couple of things together. Or
In the case of new parents, for example, that a lot of what parents may be attempted to sort of characterize as misbehavior on children's part, frequently is very normal, developmentally appropriate sorts of behavior. And the attitude I think that we as adults approach those situations with really informs a lot of what happens there. Because if we understand, oh, this is because this at this particular age. I don't know if you have this. If you use the same saying in Scotland, but toddlers are, we talk about like the terrible twos, right? That toddlers can be very cranky and obstinate in some cases. And there's one way of looking at that. If you don't know much about young children's development, as this is misbehavior, this is bad behavior. But when you look at that through a child development lens and understand, for example, that as newborns and infants, that young children are spend the better part of a year or more very highly dependent on the adults in their lives to kind of do everything for them. And suddenly they reach this phase where they are themselves mobile and capable of they're using language and they're thinking in a little different way, and suddenly have this great desire to be independent. And so just understanding that perspective, I think, can save parents a lot of heartache and grief, by just understanding what's happening with their child's development.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? I was thinking back to my own experience, that I was lucky that I had some of that knowledge. And while it didn't remove the frustration and the emotional response in me, it did give me a way of kind of being able to manage my response much more effectively, maybe, and kind of be able
Sure,
to
and it
rationalize it.
helps you to contextualize sort of
Yeah.
what this actually is, and importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah. And I think that really chimes in terms of how we move forwards and support children to develop that image of themselves as individuals and as humans, and that confidence in their own ability to regulate themselves and then access different experiences as well. Yeah, okay. So are there any particular kind of thinking or research specifically that has informed that, or is it a kind of mishmash of a whole host? And if so, can you
Oh,
dive into some?
no question. It is a mismatch of lots of things. But I have been, all throughout my career, very much fascinated by the work of the late Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, um, who really helped us to understand the social nature of learning and the opportunities that we as adults, in the case of young children, or just as teachers, generally for learners at any age, can help to support those learning experiences. But that takes a very careful eye, and it takes kind of a careful analysis of where is the child right now, and what are they, what do they know, and what are they capable of doing right now, and how can we help to sort of scaffold or support them to take just one more step through the provision of a little bit of support, whether that's support in terms of a question we might ask, or in some cases, literally sort of a physical support or accommodation in a task that they're working to master. Vygotsky's work, no question, has been a big influence on me.
I was thinking as you were talking there, I've written down a couple of things: observation, analysis, and where is the child now. But over and above that, there actually is nothing age-bound around about how you're talking about that, the impact of that research and theory.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think this is, what we're talking about. Obviously, in my case, and I know in yours, Bex, we spend a lot of time thinking about the very youngest children as learners, but the truth is that you and I learn very much the same way, and that anytime we're taking on something new, we are supported along the way from relationships and supports that others provide us, that help to set that example and help us to move just a little bit further than we could do independently.
Yeah, and that kind of penny drop moment, you can see it quite physically in young children, where they get through that frustration and then they can do it, and it's the kind of expression of happiness and joy is really quite overt. And I think that we can still find those moments of joy across the stages. And I think certainly for me, that's why I got into teaching in the first place, was just that magic moment of that penny drop.
I couldn't agree with you more. I will never, as much as I love the work that I am doing now, and the opportunity, I think the trade-off here is that I, in my current roles, am able to help to support children on a much more massive scale than I was able to as a classroom teacher. Working with a class of 20 or 25 kids. I will never, I don't think in my professional life, experience the kind of joy that I did as a kindergarten teacher, and watching kids make those connections and helping kids make those connections.
That's brilliant. Do you get that same sort of penny drop moment with the adults that you work with now?
I absolutely do. Believe it or not, it is very, very gratifying to be working with policymakers. I can tell you, it gives you a true sense of appreciation for what elected leaders go through, and the scope of their responsibility. It's so interesting. I, as kind of a single issue like I'm like really invested in early childhood, but our policymakers have to make decisions, and are called on to make decisions around really like every topic under the sun, right? That they have to worry about health policy and roads and taxes, and the list goes on and on. And so it's not necessarily appropriate or reasonable to think that that they're going to be expert on every topic they encounter. And so the opportunity to help to sort of provide that support and guidance, and help them to contextualize the importance of this work is really gratifying.
That's lovely. So in terms of your sphere of influence, then you touched on that pedagogy being much more broad than just within the school context. So what kind of ways, and are you managing to make that link between the policy support that you're doing and the more broad families and parents with their young children, so that pedagogy then becomes more disseminated, I guess, across your communities?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think pedagogy to me gets to sort of the ways in which this learning occurs. And what I am finding in various different parts of my work is that the content that I am helping to support varies a little bit. Obviously, in terms of my work with policymakers, I'm helping them to understand how other states have implemented some of these things, some of the economic benefits to taxpayers, but then with parents, helping them to understand how these supports will better their children and better prepare them for success, not only in school but in life.
Yeah, that's quite massive. And the other thing that was striking me there is you seem to balance a lot of things there together. And typically for somebody who is early years focused and driven from that kind of very personal and moral aspect of helping children to be the best they can be, mentioning something like the economic benefits of a policy kind of prima facie makes you go, oh, but actually, if we can try and catch everything together and build it together, we can almost use those for our advantage and for our children's advantage, I guess, to make sure that what we want can happen.
This is always an interesting conversation, because I think there are different messages that appeal to each of us for different reasons, and that may just be as simple as sort of our own our own backgrounds, our own someone who is coming at this work as a policymaker, as a business leader, for example, may really think in that way, right? That they're very focused on things like the return on investment, more so than maybe a preschool teacher is focused on the benefits to the individual child. And I have come to great peace with that. Honestly, I don't not much concerned with like which message resonates with you the most, as long as at the end of the day it results in something good for children and families. Then if it's the economic argument that helps to drive that policy, then great. If it's about workforce participation, great. It's really justify it however best resonates with you, as long as there are good things happening for kids at the end of the day.
And the core bit to that, I suppose, is that conversation and that dialogue, which I guess is what you're doing with your social media presence.
It is, yeah. I mean, I think just opening this up to conversation, it's been very, very gratifying, the social media the piece of this. The number, for example, of parents and grandparents who respond to me almost on a daily basis to say, "Hey, I saw that, I saw what you posted yesterday, and then I tried this with my child," is like the greatest gift to me that I could imagine. To think that here, and sitting in my home in the United States, that someone in Scotland, for example, might see something that I wrote, and that I would have some positive influence on a child there in Scotland, or in many of the other parts of the world that social media is touching, is incredible.
It's lovely to hear, and I can see on your face how how much it means to you. I think it's a really nice time at the moment, because those discussions are much more common, I suppose, not just in terms of younger children, but actually we know a lot more about science and children's neurobiology and the kind of physiological conditions that are going to support children to be more successful or learn more fluently, I guess.
That is sort of the missing link between the policy work that is the sort of the bulk of my day job, and the social media piece, because it is it's really helping to make the connection between the two. I think the more that the public understands, the more that parents and policymakers understand just how important these early years are, the more it is easy then to sort of examine what we're doing from a public policy perspective. I'll give you a good example. For many years, it has been common here in the United States for people to sort of talk about their hope that young children come to kindergarten ready to learn. as if that's where learning happens, right? At age 5. And so if you go into the policy space with the expectation that learning begins when children are 5, and that what happens in the years from prenatal until 5 is really just sort of a caretaking responsibility,
Yeah.
then you design your systems in a very different way than you would if you understood that learning is actually beginning not only from day 1, but increasingly in the literature we understand that learning is beginning in utero. And so that it's a very different responsibility there to our young children to understand that. And so by helping to shed light on just what powerful learning is happening during those early years, then has this important public policy connection that if this is the case, then what do we need to do differently? And frankly, in this country at least, there's a lot we need to do differently based on that misunderstanding, that sort of disconnect between care and education. Care is certainly important and a prerequisite, but we needn't fool ourselves into thinking that the only thing that happens during those early years is sort of basic health and safety.
Absolutely. And there is that, parents are the child's first educator. And the more parents are, I guess, intentional around about some of the things that they do, or they at least understand the massive impact that they have, not just emotionally, but holistically for the whole being. Knowledge is power, I guess. You can make things better, probably just by a bit more an understanding. One of the things that strikes me there, though, is that we are living in such a fast-paced kind of life, I guess. It's just the experience of being in our society right now is quite rushed, I guess. And what you're talking about in terms of making those links and taking that time, it's almost like we need to have a very conscious choice to stop and review. So if I give the example of a class teacher, for example, so you're a class teacher in a school, you've got 33 kids in front of you, you have curricular demands on what you're expected to get through. And although you might kind of have that awareness that there are different sources of information that might make your practice better, it feels too much to get to. It feels like another thing. So you respond in habit in what you have. And similar, I guess a lot of parents respond in habit based on how they were raised themselves.
Absolutely the case. I mean, I think we, for better and for worse, that we sort of reflect back to the world a lot of our experiences. It's fascinating, even in watching and some of these videos on social media, the number of times. I mean, there are a disappointing number of videos that people send me that include young children using profanity and having those, but then also some really lovely examples of young children who have clearly grown in households where they are deeply supported and respected, and that they mirror back exactly that sort of behavior. And I think that's true of teachers as well, at least as sort of a default mode, right? That everybody begins work as a teacher, probably reflecting a bit about what their own experiences in school were, right? That's what we know school to be. And so that's part of the importance of this whole question of pedagogy. I think one of the things that has served me particularly well throughout my career is that I've always been kind of a self-driven learner. Rarely have I ever been as interested in anything as I have been in child development and early literacy. And I discovered that, when I went into graduate school, and no question, I was a better teacher for all of the independent learning that I did. I didn't, ultimately have to rely just on what what my experiences in school were, because I went out and explored and learned on my own, and I think my pedagogy was much better for it.
Okay. So from the kind of things that we've touched on, the themes we've touched on, is there one key message that you'd like people to take away from this to inform their own practice?
Yeah, I think, to me, the message, and again, framed sort of through an early years lens, but that, that whether you are a teacher of young children, a parent, a grandparent, that understanding where they are is the greatest and most powerful pedagogical tool at our disposal. I mean, really understanding and taking the time to learn a little bit about child development in this case, and understanding what a 3-year-old thinks like. At what stage is a 3-year-old in their development? Young children are capable of such incredible, complex thinking, much more complex than I think in many cases they are given credit for. And really the key to unlocking that is sort of this understanding of who they are in that moment.
Lovely. It's our strapline for the national practice document, Realising the Ambition, is realise the ambition being me. So you have captured that entirely. It is about that knowledge throughout education, I guess. Yeah. So what's next for you, Dan?
Well, that's a good question. I hope more of the same, more of an opportunity to continue helping to guide this public policy work in states across the U.S. But one of the exciting things to me, Bex, about this new sort of venture of mine, where I'm now more self-employed and able to consider kind of where and how I use my time, is hopefully an opportunity to take things to a little bit bigger scale too, in terms of possibly connecting more on an international basis. So we will see. One thing that is very exciting, though not ready to announce all the details quite yet. I am working on a book that I expect will be out later this fall, that will cover a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. And so that's very exciting. I think along with it will come more opportunities to do some public speaking and teaching, and with new audiences and new groups. So who knows, maybe a trip to Scotland is in my
brilliant. Let me know when you're here, and I'll catch up and take you down to Edinburgh.
I love it.
Fantastic. And as we caught up just before we started recording, you were saying that this last bit is probably the bit that's given you the biggest headache. Your 2 tracks to go on our playlist.
So I can tell from your wall of music there behind you that you and I are kindred spirits as great music lovers. In fact, I mentioned that my part of my early career was in broadcast journalism. I worked for a time in radio as a music director. And so I have had this great passion for music my whole life. And so asking me to pick like my 2 most inspirational songs is something I would have to think for weeks on. But since you are pressing me today, I've thought of 2. I think there was a wonderful song from the early 90s called "You Get What You Give" by the band New Radicals, which I think has always been really uplifting to me. And the other one, just in sort of the context of the teaching that we've been talking about in my work with young children, I think of probably the very shortest song by the Beatles, which was called "The End." It's the very last finishing track on the Abbey Road album. It's I don't know, like 20 or 30 seconds long, and I can quote the entire thing to you because it's like one sentence. But it is, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And I think it's sort of a lovely encapsulation of not only my work, but I think all of our work in early years education.
Thank you. And for someone who was finding that difficult, you summed that up beautifully. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our chat. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast.
Oh, Bex, thank you for having me.